Story 1. I'll never forget that night at the morgue. It was supposed to be just another overtime shift. Quiet, uneventful, routine. But what happened has stayed with me, burned into my memory like a scar I can't erase. I work as a medical examiner in a city morgue. The silence, the stillness, they never bothered me. In fact, I found them comforting. The dead don't argue or judge. But that night, the silence was different. It felt alive. It was a Tuesday, and I had stayed late to finish paperwork. The air was heavy with the sterile scent of formaldehyde and disinfectant. The faint hum of fluorescent lights was the only sound. My desk lamp cast a small circle of light in the otherwise dim room. Then I heard it, a faint, muffled sound, like someone calling out from far away. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, just the result of a long, exhausting day. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, more persistent. The sound seemed to be coming from the cold storage room, where we kept the bodies. My pulse quickened as I stood, the rational part of me insisting it was just a trick of the mind. Yet the screaming grew louder, more frantic. The cold storage was dimly lit, the rows of steel drawers gleaming dully under the weak overhead lights. The air inside was icy, prickling my skin like needles. The screams were everywhere, echoing off the walls. But somehow I knew they were coming from one of the drawers. I hesitated, standing frozen in place. The drawer in the center seemed to vibrate slightly, as if something, or someone, was pounding from the inside. My stomach churned, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't. My hand reached for the handle, almost of its own accord, and I pulled. The drawer slid open with a metallic groan, and there he was, a man in his mid-30s, pale and motionless. Just as he'd been when I prepared him earlier. But now his face was contorted in an expression of pure terror. His mouth hung open, frozen mid-scream, and his glassy eyes stared upward, unseeing but filled with fear. I stumbled back, cold sweat beating on my forehead. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. He hadn't looked like this before. He'd been peaceful. Now his face told a story I couldn't begin to understand. The screaming stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. The room felt stifling, the air heavy. My hands trembled as I tried to steady myself. The silence should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It felt worse, like something was waiting. Then his hand moved. It was a small twitch, just the faintest flex of his fingers, but it sent me stumbling backward until I hit the counter. My legs felt like they might give out beneath me. My mind scrambled for explanations, post-mortem spasms, a trick of the light, but none of them felt right. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. My shaking fingers fumbled, and the phone slipped from my grasp, clattering loudly on the tile floor. The noise jolted me out of my stupor, and I knelt to pick it up. When I looked back at the drawer, his face was normal again. The terror was gone. His expression was calm, serene, just as it had been before. I slammed the drawer shut and stumbled out of the room, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the weight of what I had just witnessed pressing down on me. I sat at my desk trying to rationalize, to convince myself it was exhaustion or a hallucination. The next morning, I forced myself to check the drawer again. It was empty. Confusion turned to dread as I checked the logbook. His body was supposed to be there, but there was no record of it being removed. No one had signed it out, and no transport was scheduled. I called the funeral home listed on his file, but they said they hadn't picked him up. When I asked my coworkers, they looked at me like I was crazy. They insisted there had been no new bodies brought in that night. No one by his name had ever been processed. I searched for his paperwork, the file I had filled out the previous day, but it was gone. No trace of him remained. Not in the records, not in the morgue, not anywhere. I quit a few weeks later. I told myself it was the stress or the hours, but the truth was I couldn't face the thought of stepping into that cold storage room again. Even now, I sometimes hear the scream. It echoes in my mind late at night, pulling me back to that icy room and the man with the face of terror. I've stopped trying to explain it. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Story 2, I've been a paramedic for years, and I've seen my fair share of horrific things, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for that night. It's burned into my memory like a nightmare I can't wake up from. I still don't fully understand what happened, but I can't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. It all started like a routine call. We got a dispatch for an injured man, reportedly a squatter at an old abandoned house. These kinds of calls aren't unusual, especially in areas where the city's forgotten about the buildings. Homeless people take refuge in them, and sometimes they get hurt. But when I arrived at the scene with my partner Tyler, I knew something wasn't right. The house was a rundown mess, a decaying shell of its former self. The windows were broken, and the air inside smelled like mold and rot. The front door was hanging off its hinges, barely attached to the frame. We walked in, flashlights cutting through the pitch-black darkness, and there was a sense of stillness in the air that sent a chill up my spine. It was too quiet. We found him upstairs, lying on the floor in a pool of blood. The man was unconscious, breathing shallowly, and covered in deep, ragged bite marks that I could tell weren't from any animal I'd ever seen. These weren't the kind of wounds that came from a dog or a rat. The shape of the bites, the jagged edges. It was as if something had taken a huge, savage chunk out of him, tearing through muscle and bone like it was nothing. Tyler started working on him, trying to stabilize him, but I couldn't stop looking at those wounds. The blood was everywhere, drenched into his clothes, pooling around his head, seeping into the wooden floor. His face was pale, but his eyes were wide open, glazed with fear even though he was unconscious. We managed to get him onto a stretcher, and that's when the man, barely clinging to life, muttered something that sent a shiver down my spine. "She's still here," he whispered, his voice barely audible, like it was taking every ounce of energy he had left just to speak. I froze. I didn't know who or what he was talking about. I didn't ask. I just nodded, trying to keep it together. But something about his words unsettled me. It felt wrong. Like he wasn't just talking about someone in the room with us, like he was speaking of something else, something that didn't belong in that house. We hurried to get him out of there. Tyler was focused on the patient, checking his vitals while I kept an eye on the surroundings. It was then that I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was soft at first, just a faint, wet noise, like someone dragging their feet through thick mud. I turned toward the sound, my stomach flipping. There was nothing, just the broken-down room we were in, and the faint light from our flashlights bouncing off the peeling wallpaper. But then I saw it. Bloody footprints, large, heavy prints, dripping thick red blood onto the floor, like someone had been walking barefoot through a pool of it. The prints were wet, fresh, and they were coming straight toward us. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck as I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. "Tyler," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to go. Now." But Tyler was still focused on the man, his hands working to keep the guy alive. He didn't seem to notice the bloodstained trail inching closer to us. I could feel the panic rising in my throat. Something wasn't right. The air in that room had shifted. The oppressive stillness felt like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. The footsteps got louder. The wet slapping sound echoed through the room, getting closer and closer, as if whatever was making them was moving slowly toward us. I turned to look at Tyler, but when I looked back, the blood-stained footprints were right behind us. They were too close, too damn close. My heart was in my throat now, my skin prickled with terror. I could feel something or someone watching us from the shadows. The footsteps stopped suddenly and I could hear ragged breathing, wet and drawn out, like something was struggling to get air into its lungs. The room felt colder, even though it was a summer night. The hairs on my arms stood straight up, and my eyes scanned the shadows, searching for any movement. But there was nothing, just darkness. That's when it happened. I heard a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. It was a deep, animalistic sound, like something out of a nightmare. It wasn't even the kind of sound you hear in movies. It was real. It was close. It was right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't, but I felt it. The weight of something heavy moving behind us, shifting closer with every second. I felt Tyler's hand grab my arm, pulling me toward the door. We didn't even finish the strapping the patient into the stretcher. We just ran. We bolted out of that room, down the stairs, through the wrecked hallway, and out into the open air. We didn't stop running until we were back in the ambulance. I jammed the key into the ignition, and we tore out of there, tires screeching, leaving behind the house, the man, and whatever was inside. I was breathing so fast I couldn't catch my breath. My hands were shaking, my heart thundering in my chest. Tyler, too, was silent, his face pale as he stared straight ahead. We didn't talk about it on the drive back. We didn't need to. Neither of us had seen anything, but we both felt it. Whatever it was in that house, that thing that had been walking behind us, dragging itself through the blood. We both knew it wasn't human. When we got back to the station, we called for backup, a team to retrieve the man and investigate the scene. I couldn't shake the shame of abandoning him, but in my gut, I knew staying would have been a death sentence. It took over an hour for reinforcements to organize and arrive at the house. Tyler and I returned with them, reluctant but duty-bound. When we entered, everything was wrong. The blood, the stretcher, the man, everything was gone. The house was eerily pristine, as if no one had been there in years. Dust coated every surface. The sagging floorboards that had been soaked in blood earlier were dry and cracked, undisturbed. The smell of decay and rot was still heavy in the air, but there were no signs of struggle, no footprints, and no body. The others looked at us like we were crazy when we tried to explain. Tyler and I couldn't even make sense of it ourselves. But as we were about to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the wall near where we'd found the man, there was a single crimson handprint. Fresh and dripping, it stood out starkly against the peeling wallpaper. But when I pointed it out to the others, it was gone. Just like the man, just like the blood, it had vanished. I'll never be able to explain it. The bloody footprints, the growl, the sensation of something lurking just out of sight. I don't know what happened in that house, and I don't want to know. But every time I think about it, I remember the man's last words. She's still here. I don't know who she was, but I don't think we were supposed to be there. I don't think anyone was, and I'll never step foot in that place again. Story 3. Working in palliative care means accepting that death is a constant presence. It's a heavy reality, but it also comes with moments of grace. Watching families say their goodbyes, holding a patient's hand as they find peace. I've learned to find comfort in those moments, or at least I thought I had until I encountered something I can't explain. It started with a patient named Mrs. Harrington. She was in her late 70s, battling a relentless cancer that had left her weak and frail. Despite everything, she had a serene air about her, a quiet acceptance of her situation that was rare in patients facing the end. I admired her strength. She often talked about feeling a sense of calm at night, which I initially attributed to the medication managing her pain. I thought nothing of it until she began mentioning a visitor, a kind woman, as she described her. Mrs. Harrington said the woman would sit at the edge of her bed and hold her hand, offering comfort through the long, sleepless nights. At first, I assumed it was one of the night shift nurses. The team was known for going above and beyond, especially in the palliative ward. Comforting a patient in their final days wasn't uncommon, and it didn't seem out of the ordinary. Still, I asked around, more out of curiosity than concern. None of the nurses admitted to spending time in her room beyond their routine checks. They all seemed genuinely puzzled when I mentioned it. Some even joked that maybe Mrs. Harrington's medications were making her imagine things. The idea unsettled me a little, but I didn't dwell on it. In this line of work, you see all kinds of strange things. Hallucinations, vivid dreams, even out-of-body experiences. I chalked it up to her mind finding a way to cope. But there was something about the way Mrs. Harrington spoke of the visitor that stuck with me. It wasn't the disjointed rambling of someone confused or heavily medicated. Her descriptions were consistent, almost matter-of-fact. She talked about the woman's calm presence, the way she seemed to know exactly when Mrs. Harrington needed her. A few days later, Mrs. Harrington passed away peacefully. Her family had visited earlier in the evening, and when the nurse on duty went in to check on her, she was gone. Her expression was serene, and her hands were folded neatly across her chest. After her passing, the room was closed for cleaning, as was standard procedure. I thought that would be the end of it. The story of her mysterious visitor faded into the background of my mind, overshadowed by the steady rhythm of new patients, new cases, and the unrelenting demands of the ward. About a week later, the room was reopened and assigned to a new patient. Her name was Laura, a middle-aged woman with late-stage heart failure. She was struggling, her condition deteriorating rapidly despite our best efforts. I remember thinking how frail she looked in the stark hospital bed, her breath shallow and labored. On my second night shift after Laura's arrival, she mentioned something that made my stomach drop. She asked if we had someone who visited patients at night. When I asked why, she described a woman sitting at the edge of her bed, holding her hand. My chest tightened as she spoke. The description was eerily similar to what Mrs. Harrington had said. Laura's tone was calm, almost casual, as though she assumed it was just part of the care we provided. I didn't tell her about Mrs. Harrington. Instead, I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe one of the nurses had been particularly attentive, or maybe Laura had overheard something and her mind had filled in the blanks. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but then it happened again and again. Laura consistently described the same visitor, a calm, kind woman who brought her comfort during the night. I double-checked the night logs, questioned the staff, even reviewed the security footage outside the room. There was nothing unusual. No one had been in or out of her room apart from the standard checks. The sense of unease grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't fear exactly, but a deep, gnawing discomfort. I'd worked in hospitals for years and had always trusted what I could see, what I could measure, what I could explain. But this was different. Laura passed away a week later. Her death was sudden but not unexpected. When I entered her room to confirm, I found her in the same position as Mrs. Harrington, peaceful, her hands folded neatly across her chest. After Laura's death, I couldn't stop thinking about the two women and their mysterious visitor. I began to dig into the room's history, scouring records and talking to staff who had been there longer than me. What I found didn't provide answers, only more questions. Over the years, several patients who had stayed in that room had mentioned a similar experience, a comforting presence, a figure that seemed to watch over them in their final days. The descriptions varied slightly, but the essence was always the same, a kind woman, calm and silent, who brought peace when it was most needed. I never saw her myself. Sometimes I wonder if I would have felt comforted or terrified if I had. Even now I think about her when I pass that room. I no longer question whether she's real. Too many coincidences, too many stories, and the unmistakable peace she seemed to bring. I don't know who or what she is. A ghost? An angel? Some remnant of energy from lives that passed through the room? I don't have answers, and I've stopped trying to find them. What I do know is this: the woman at the bedside wasn't there to harm anyone. She brought comfort to people in their darkest moments. And while I'll never fully understand what I witnessed, I find solace in that small truth. In a place filled with pain and loss, she was a quiet reminder that sometimes the unknown can bring not fear, but peace. Story 4. I've been a coroner for years now, and after all this time, I thought I had seen it all. The odd cases, the bizarre accidents, even the ones that left me wondering how they could happen. But there's one case I'll never forget, the one that changed the way I look at death forever. It all started with the body of a woman who had died under mysterious circumstances. She was found in her bedroom, locked inside, with no signs of struggle or foul play. No apparent injuries, no reason to explain why she died. It was as if her body just gave out. Her cause of death was undetermined, and it was up to me to figure out what had happened. When the body arrived at the morgue, everything seemed normal at first. It was cold to the touch, as expected. No signs of life. The woman's skin was pale and her eyes were wide open, but there was nothing strange about her, at least not yet. I was used to the stillness, the silence. You get used to it after a while. I began the autopsy, making the first incision and pulling back the skin. There was nothing unusual about the process. I continued with the routine, opening up the chest cavity to inspect the internal organs. But that's when it happened. At first, it was a faint sound. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but it was deep inside the body. A low, wet sound, almost like something shifting in there. I stopped for a second, thinking it was just the usual air pockets you sometimes get when you cut into the chest. But the noise grew louder, almost like something scraping against the inside of the body. I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The air in the morgue was thick, and the lighting made everything feel off. I leaned in closer, trying to focus, but the sound didn't stop. It continued, scraping, shifting, wet squelches coming from somewhere inside her. My heart started racing. I stepped back and checked for any signs of life. A pulse, a heartbeat, anything. But there was nothing. Her body was cold, stiff with rigor mortis. She was undeniably dead. There was no reason for any noise to be coming from her body. Yet the sound continued. It was as if something was moving inside her, something that shouldn't have been there. I tried to push the unease out of my mind and continued with the autopsy. But the longer I worked, the worse it got. The scraping noises turned into something worse, something more like gnawing. The sound was sickening, like claws scratching against bone. I had never heard anything like it before. It was as if something was alive inside her, struggling to get out. I paused again, standing over the body, trying to convince myself it was just my nerves. I checked her chest cavity again, trying to see if I'd missed anything. I didn't find anything unusual. No air pockets, no reason for the sound. But it was there. The noise was unmistakable. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Tiny dark shapes began to stir under her skin. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then the shapes started to move. Tiny little figures that wriggled and squirmed beneath the surface of her flesh. It was as if something was pushing its way out from within her body, something that shouldn't have been there. I stepped back, my hands shaking as I reached for my instruments. I didn't know what to do. The shapes became larger, darker, and I realized, with a sudden, awful clarity, what I was seeing. Spiders. Hundreds of them. They crawled out from the incision in her chest, their black bodies wriggling and scuttling as they spilled out, over her organs, her ribs, her neck. They poured out in a steady stream, flooding the table in a writhing mass. They were crawling over her insides, moving in every direction, as if they had been hiding inside her body, waiting to emerge. I froze, unable to move. The sound of their tiny legs skittering over her skin was deafening. It wasn't just a few spiders. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, spilling out of the body, filling the table with their black, shiny bodies. Their tiny legs scraped against the inside of her ribs, their bodies moving over every inch of her. My stomach churned. I stumbled back, horrified by what I was seeing. I tried to breathe, to steady myself, but I couldn't. The spiders kept coming, crawling out from every opening, from the incisions I had made, from the woman's throat, from her eyes. They covered her body. They swarmed over the table. I could barely process what was happening, but all I could think was, I need to get out. I ran. I don't even know how I managed to get out of there. My legs were shaking, my mind racing. I ran down the hallway, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air. I didn't even think to call anyone, didn't know who to call. The images of the spiders, of the woman's body, haunted me. I stayed away from the morgue for the rest of the night, not daring to return. I tried to shake it off, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the skittering of their legs, the sound of them crawling, moving inside her. I couldn't get the image out of my head, the spiders pouring out of her like a flood. The next morning, I gathered my courage and went back to the morgue, hoping that maybe it had all been a bad dream. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I knew I had to go back. When I arrived, I was met with an even worse surprise. The body was gone. The autopsy table was completely empty. The woman's body had vanished. No sign of it anywhere. No blood, no spiders, nothing. It was as if the body had never been there at all. I checked the room, thinking maybe someone had moved it, but there was no one there. No sign of the woman, no sign of the spiders. Everything was as clean as it had been before. It was as if nothing had happened. But then I noticed something. something that made my blood run cold. On the wall behind the table, there was a handprint, a bloody handprint smeared across the white wall. It was fresh, the blood still dark and thick. The handprint was large, the fingers long and unnatural, like they didn't belong to a human. The smear of blood looked as though someone had dragged their hand across the wall in desperation, as if they were trying to escape. I stood there staring at the handprint, unable to move. My heart was racing. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what had happened. Where had the body gone? Where had the spiders come from? What had I witnessed in that morgue? I never spoke to anyone about it. I couldn't. The thought of it still gives me chills. But every time I walk past that morgue, I feel a shiver run down my spine. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint scratching sound, like tiny claws scraping against bone. And I wonder if whatever came out of that woman's body, whatever had been hiding inside her, is still out there. Waiting. Story 5. I've been a nurse on the pediatric ward for 5 years. Most of the time, the job is exactly what you expect. Busy, tiring, but ultimately fulfilling. You spend long hours caring for children, comforting parents, and making sure everything runs smoothly. It's a job full of routines. And over the years, I've grown used to the quiet nights, the occasional beeping of machines, and the hum of fluorescent lights. But even after all this time, there are things that can still make you stop in your tracks, things that no amount of experience can prepare you for. It was late on a shift when it happened, just before the clock struck midnight. The ward was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that settles in when most of the children are asleep. I'd just finished checking on a few of my patients, and I was walking down the hall to check on a little girl who just had surgery earlier that day. As I passed room 205, I heard something faint, soft sobbing. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The pediatric ward can be quiet, but the sound of a child crying, especially in the middle of the night, wasn't exactly unusual. But there was something different about this. It wasn't a whimper or a whine. It was the kind of sobbing you hear when someone is deeply upset. Genuine, uncontrollable crying. I paused outside the door, confused. Room 205 had been vacant that night. I'd checked the schedule before I started my rounds. The little girl I was supposed to see had been moved to another room earlier that day. No one was supposed to be there. Curious and a bit concerned, I slowly pushed the door open. The soft sobs grew louder, and my heart started to race. I peered inside. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of the hallway light, and everything seemed normal at first glance. The bed was neatly made, and the usual equipment was in place. But as I stepped in further, my eyes landed on something unexpected. There, sitting on the edge of the bed, was a small child. Her back was turned to me, and her tiny shoulders shook with each sob. I froze. There was no way a child could have gotten into this room. This was supposed to be an empty space, and yet here she was, crying quietly to herself. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. I couldn't see her face clearly, but her posture was hunched, as if she was trying to hide her tears. I took a cautious step forward, my instincts telling me to help, but also warning me that something wasn't quite right. "Hey, sweetie," I called out softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you okay?" The sobbing stopped immediately. My heart skipped a beat. The sudden silence was worse than the crying. I waited, hoping the child would speak or turn around, but she didn't. She just sat there, perfectly still. I hesitated for a moment, then took another step closer, my hand reaching out gently. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Still no response. Just the faint sound of my own breathing and the soft hum of the machines in the room. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I didn't want to panic. "It's okay," I said, my voice trying to remain calm. "I'm a nurse. I'm here to help." I reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, hoping that would get her attention. But as soon as my hand made contact, the child's body jerked away from me. She turned her head quickly, and when I saw her face, I nearly stumbled back in shock. Her eyes were wide open, filled with an overwhelming sadness, but there was something in them, a hollow, empty look, like she wasn't really there. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung in messy strands around her face. It wasn't the face of a normal child. It was the face of someone who had been through something horrible, something that left them broken and lost. Before I could say anything, she slowly lifted her hands to her face, hiding her eyes as if she were trying to shield herself from something. I took another step closer, trying to comfort her. "It's okay," I said again, more quietly this time, as I crouched down beside her. "I'm not going to hurt you." I don't know why I said that. It was a silly thing to say, but at the time, it felt like the right thing to do. The child didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way, but I could feel the weight of her presence. It was like the air in the room had thickened, becoming heavier with every second I spent there. The longer I stayed, the more the room seemed to change. I could feel the temperature drop, a coldness creeping in that hadn't been there before. I glanced over my shoulder, my unease growing, but the hallway outside was empty. No one had come in. No one had seen me walk in. It was just me and the child. After a few moments, the child finally lifted her head, but this time, her face seemed even more strange. Her eyes weren't just sad anymore. They were wide with something else, fear, or perhaps recognition. She stared at me for a long moment, and I felt like she was trying to tell me something, though she never spoke a word. Without warning, she stood up from the bed. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled in strange directions. She didn't look at me as she walked toward the door. Her tiny feet made no sound on the floor. The whole scene felt surreal, like I was watching something in a dream. "Wait," I called after her, but she didn't stop. She simply moved to the door, her back still turned to me, and opened it. It was as if she knew exactly where she was going, as if she had done it countless times before. She stepped out into the hallway, and I followed her, unsure of what to do, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I stepped into the hallway, there was no child. She was gone. The hallway was completely empty, just like it had been before I had entered the room. I stood there stunned, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. I walked down the hallway looking into every room, but there was no sign of her. I returned to room 205, feeling a cold dread seep into my bones. The room was empty, just as it had been before. The bed was untouched, the machine still humming softly, and everything was in place. But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Confused and unsettled, I left the room and went straight to the nurse's station. I needed to talk to someone. I found my colleague, Sarah, and I told her what had happened, how I had seen the child crying, how she had looked at me with those empty eyes, and how she had disappeared when I followed her. Sarah looked at me with wide eyes and took a deep breath. "You saw her," she said quietly, almost to herself. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Room 205, it's been empty for years. That's where Emily died." I felt my stomach drop. "Emily?" Sarah nodded. "She was a little girl, no more than 6 years old. She died there after a surgery went wrong. The hospital closed the room after that, kept it locked up. But some people say Emily's spirit still wanders the halls. They say she's still waiting for someone to help her." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what had happened. The child I had seen, the one I had tried to help, was Emily. And now I couldn't help but wonder, was she still in that room? Was she still waiting? I haven't been back to room 205 since that night, and I'm not sure I ever will. The memory of her eyes, empty and desperate, haunts me every time I walk down that hallway. And every time I hear the soft sobbing echoing in the silence, I know she's still there, waiting for someone to help her. Story 1, I'll never forget my first year working in the ICU. I had signed up for the night shift because, well, the stories were true. That's where you'd see things that stayed with you, things that never made it to the morning briefing. It was a small hospital in a big city, and we had our fair share of rough cases. It was an old building too, creaky floors and narrow hallways with bad lighting, especially at night. Half of the ICU was undergoing renovations, so the patients we did take in were kept in close quarters. That place always had a heaviness to it, especially in the night shift. But there was one night, one case that settled that unease into something colder. I remember it was around Halloween. The place was at capacity, like always, but this time we had two patients who were an absolute nightmare, figuratively and literally. They were at opposite ends of the ward, but you could still feel the tension radiating between them. One was a man in his late 40s, big guy, loud, with this scar that ran from his eyebrow to his jaw. His name was Mike, but to us he was just the pimp. His injuries were extensive, mostly burns that had him wrapped up in bandages from the waist up. Down the other end of the hall, they kept his ex-girl, as the other nurses called her. She was younger, early 20s maybe, name was Lisa. She'd come in with burns that nearly covered her face and neck, but the worst was the damage from smoke inhalation. We could never get a clear story from her before she'd been put on a ventilator. But from what we knew, he'd lit her on fire, and in some kind of desperate act of survival or vengeance, she'd latched onto him as they both burned. If you asked me, it was like she wanted to drag him down with her. She was barely hanging on, and we all knew it was only a matter of time. The thing was, neither of them knew the other was in the same ICU. There was an unspoken rule that if you were assigned to him, you didn't talk about her, and if you were with her, you didn't talk about him. Some kind of silent agreement to keep whatever hatred or horror they shared from spilling over into our hallways. That night I was assigned to Lisa. I remember checking her vitals, looking over her chart, noting how her lungs were still barely functioning. She'd had a bad night, worse than usual. She was slipping fast, and part of me felt like maybe she'd just given up the fight. The monitor beside her beeped steadily, but her chest barely rose. I tried to talk to her sometimes, hoping maybe she could hear me. Maybe it'd help her hang on. But she never reacted, just lay there, face obscured by gauze and tubes, her breath so faint I'd have to lean in just to hear the raspy rhythm. About an hour later, her monitor started screaming. I looked up, and there it was. Flatline. We called the code and I jumped in, doing compressions while my partner handled the meds. We worked on her for almost 20 minutes, and it was as if the whole place was holding its breath. When we finally stopped, I looked around the room, half expecting her to just open her eyes to jolt back to life. But Lisa was gone. We packed up, turned off the machines, and covered her with a sheet. I walked out of her room, and the hall felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down. Most of us were on edge, and some of the nurses went for a coffee break just to get out of that section for a while. There was this silence, an oppressive sort of quiet that settled after a death. I remember thinking, thank God she was finally free of him. And then I heard it. Down the hallway, the pimp started screaming. I'd heard him before. He had a mouth on him for sure, and the man hated nurses, hated doctors, hated anybody in a uniform. But this was different. The hairs on my arms shot up as his voice cut through the quiet, echoing down the hall. Get her out, he screamed, a hoarse, desperate roar that seemed to tear through him. Get the goddamn bitch out of my room, now! Every single one of us froze. His voice was raw, jagged, like he was being tortured. Another nurse, Maria, shot me a look, her eyes wide, and we both hurried down the hallway toward his room. His bed was surrounded by machines, and he was hooked up to a dozen monitors, unable to move more than an inch without setting off an alarm. He couldn't have gotten up if he tried. We pushed the door open, and there he was, thrashing as much as his injuries would allow, eyes wild and unfocused, fixed on something in the corner of the room. His face was twisted in terror, his bandaged hands reaching out as if to ward off something only he could see. Sweat poured down his face, matting his greasy hair against his forehead, and his mouth moved in a near-hysterical chant. She's here, he gasped, voice cracking. She's right there, I can see her. He looked at me, desperation and something else, something primal burning in his eyes. Get her out, he whispered. She's waiting for me, I can feel it. I took a step back, unsure if I was even breathing at this point. Maria tried to talk him down, saying, There's no one here, Mike. You're alone. It's just us. But he wouldn't hear it. He started sobbing, shaking, eyes darting around the room as if he was trapped. The alarm started going off as his heart rate spiked. He flinched, gasping, and pointed at the corner again, where the shadows seemed just a shade darker, heavier. "She's waiting," he choked out, each word trembling. "I can smell the smoke. She's burning. She's still burning." It hit me then, the smell, a faint, acrid scent that lingered in the air, like burned hair and scorched fabric. The smell was faint but unmistakable, and it chilled me to the bone. Maria's face went pale, and we both exchanged a look that said everything. We couldn't see her, but he did, and by the look in his eyes, she was closer than we'd ever know. Story 2. I'd been a nurse for years, and I thought I'd seen it all, or at least enough to stop believing that anything could surprise me. People don't like to talk about what happens in hospitals after dark, what we see, what we don't understand but pretend to. We're supposed to be the professionals, right? So when things go wrong, when something falls outside the usual explanations, well, we tend to brush it off, laugh it off. But I still remember that night, the way the hallway felt different, colder. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed just a little louder than usual. Or maybe I only remember it that way now because of what happened. It was the graveyard shift, the one that always put me on edge. There's a different kind of quiet that settles over a hospital at night, as if even the building knows it's time to let go, to let the night in. My shift that night was pretty routine at first, no emergencies, just the usual rounds. My station was across from room 209, where Mrs. Lacey had been placed. Mrs. Lacey was difficult. She was old in her 90s and her health had taken a sharp decline in recent days. She was confused, combative, frail but stronger than she looked. Always struggling against something, trying to get out of bed, yelling out words that didn't make sense. I'd seen patients like her before. People who, in their last days, seemed to fight the hardest, thrashing and yelling as if something we couldn't see was holding them down. She had a sitter in there with her, a younger nurse's aide named Abby, just to keep an eye on her so she didn't hurt herself or someone else. I'd pop my head in occasionally to see Abby looking exhausted, trying to keep Mrs. Lacey calm, her eyes wide and alert, as if she knew something was going to happen. Then it started. The monitors in her room began beeping. First a slow warning sound, and then faster, insistent. My heart dropped. I knew the rhythm. I knew what it meant. Mrs. Lacey's heart rate was dropping, fast. I rushed in with 2 other nurses, one of whom was already calling her vitals. 30, 20, and then it was a flat line, just like that. I checked her pulse. Nothing. Cold as marble. Her eyes were still open, staring blankly at the ceiling. We weren't supposed to resuscitate. Her DNR was clear. It wasn't the first time I'd watched someone pass, but I still took a shaky breath as I closed her eyelids and let the monitors go silent. It was over. I stepped outside the room to call her family. Abby stayed behind to do the paperwork, start preparing her body, standard protocol. When I was almost done with the paperwork, Abby appeared in the doorway, white as a sheet. She's moving, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stared at her, not quite understanding. Come again? She's moving, Abby repeated, and I could see the terror in her eyes. She wasn't joking. This wasn't some poor taste prank. I'd known her long enough to know the look on her face meant it was something I couldn't ignore. I exchanged a glance with another nurse, who shook her head in disbelief. Together, we walked back into room 209, the 2 of us probably looking more than a little nervous ourselves. And then we saw it. Mrs. Lacey was lying there, still as she had been when we left. Her face was blank, her body still. We took a step closer, and that's when her hand twitched. It wasn't a minor movement, not a muscle spasm or the result of rigor mortis setting in. No, it was a deliberate movement, a tightening of her fist, as if she were reaching out for something. Her other hand followed, gripping the sheets with surprising strength, almost clawing at them. My breath caught, and then she let out this sound, a horrible guttural noise halfway between a moan and a scream. I've never heard anything like it before or since. The sound echoed down the hall, chilling the blood of everyone who heard it. It was like she was in agony, like she was fighting against something we couldn't see, something that was dragging her back. And her eyes opened, wide and blank and staring straight at me. Help! Me! she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they'd been cemented to the floor, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was gone. I'd checked her pulse myself. Abby let out a small scream, and I snapped out of my trance. I turned to grab her, intending to pull her out of the room. But as I did, Mrs. Lacey's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was impossibly strong, bone-crushing, and ice-cold. Her eyes never left mine as she repeated, "Help! Me!" I tried to wrench my arm free, but she held on with inhuman strength. Her mouth opened wider, and it felt like she was trying to say something more. But the words wouldn't come. The smell in the room shifted then, a staleness I can only describe as old, damp earth. It was suffocating, unnatural, and seemed to press down on all of us. Finally, one of the other nurses pulled me back, and Mrs. Lacey's hand dropped limply to her side. Her eyes fluttered closed, her grip loosened, and that horrible guttural noise stopped. Just like that, she was still again. The monitors around her stayed silent, flatlining, showing no signs of life. We all stood there in stunned silence. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I backed out of the room, the others following close behind me. We shut the door and locked it, then stood there, just listening, barely breathing. But no more sounds came, just the stillness of the room, a silence so absolute it was terrifying. It was only later, long after we'd finished the paperwork, called the family, and completed the night shift, that I found myself alone in the break room, staring at my trembling hands. That night, as I walked through the hallways, every sound seemed louder, every shadow seemed darker, and the image of Mrs. Lacey's eyes, open, desperate, filled with an agony I couldn't explain, haunted me. Story 3. I worked in a pediatric hospital, a place where I'd spent more time than I could count. It was a small hospital, but we had a reputation for taking care of some of the most delicate cases. Newborns, kids with cancer, severe trauma. The kind of work that breaks your heart and heals it again, all at once. The oncology unit was on the 4th floor, and I'd heard the rumors from the very first day I started there. The stories about the place being haunted, particularly the hallway just outside the oncology rooms. At first, I thought it was just gossip. Nurses and doctors have their ways of coping with stress, and ghost stories are a common outlet. But there was always something off about the 4th floor. The air was heavier there. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the whole area felt different. Even the lights had a dim, unnatural hue. Some nights I'd walk through it alone, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up, as if I wasn't alone, even though I was. I worked 3 12-hour shifts a week, but on this particular week, I'd picked up some overtime. It was late, past 3 a.m., and I was in the NICU. I was exhausted, long shift, barely any sleep. It felt like everything was muffled, as though the whole world outside the NICU was happening in a distant dream. But a break was long overdue, so I decided to go down to the cafeteria to grab a coffee. The cafeteria was on the 2nd floor, and there was a shortcut, a staircase, right off the oncology unit that led directly down. I'd taken that route plenty of times before, but not at night. Never at night. I don't know why it took me that route this time. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was because the hallway was empty. Maybe it was because I was too tired to even think straight. But as I approached the automatic double doors to the oncology unit, I hesitated. The hallway was dark, quiet, and eerie. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me. I pushed the doors open, and that's when I saw him, a little boy, skipping down the hallway. It wasn't like I'd seen him at first. He was there, and then he wasn't. But that moment, that heartbeat between seeing and not seeing him, froze me in place. The boy was maybe 4 or 5, his thin, hospital-issued gown trailing behind him as he moved. His feet tapped lightly against the polished floor as he skipped toward me, his arms swinging carelessly, his face bright and unbothered. For a moment, I thought maybe a parent was with him, or perhaps he was one of the patients who'd managed to sneak out of his room. "Hey, buddy," I called out, my voice trembling just a little. "Where's your mom or dad?" The boy didn't respond. He just turned to face me, his eyes wide and glassy. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. One moment he was there, just a few feet away, and the next, nothing. No sound, no movement, no trace of him at all. I stepped forward, my heart racing, thinking maybe he ducked into one of the rooms. I checked the hallway, quickly scanning every corner, but it was empty. Not a single sound, not even the hum of the lights above me. I stood there frozen, trying to process what had just happened. My mind told me it was exhaustion. Maybe I'd seen a shadow, a flicker in the dim light. But no, I knew what I'd seen. I turned quickly, my pulse thudding in my ears. I needed that coffee. I needed to get out of there, and I needed to get out now. But as I walked quickly toward the staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence pressed on me like a weight. My skin felt tight, like someone was watching me. I glanced back once more, half expecting to see the little boy standing there again, but the hallway was empty. Still, the feeling lingered. I made it to the stairs and hurried down to the second floor, trying to tell myself it was just a trick of the mind. But even as I grabbed my coffee and sat down in the cafeteria, the tension in my chest wouldn't ease. I couldn't shake the image of that boy, his face, his eyes, the way he disappeared so quickly. The rest of my shift was a blur. I kept expecting to hear a child's voice or to see something moving in the shadows, but nothing happened. The night crept on, and the incident felt like a distant memory, a strange thing that my mind would keep locked away for later reflection. But when I returned to work the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I hadn't said anything to anyone. Who would believe me? But then, I overheard a conversation between two nurses in the break room. One of them was recounting a story from her shift last night. "I swear I saw him again," she said. "That little boy, skipping down the hall outside the oncology unit. I thought he was lost, but when I called out, he just disappeared." I froze. My coffee cup shook in my hands. She wasn't talking about the same thing, the same boy. "Who?" I asked too loudly. The nurse looked at me startled. "The little boy, the one who skips in the hallway. You've seen him, right?" I nodded slowly, trying to keep my composure. "Yeah, I've seen him." But now it was real. It wasn't just something I imagined. There were others who had seen it too. And when I asked around later, more and more people came forward with their own stories. Some had seen the boy in the hallway outside oncology, others by the elevators. Some claimed to have heard the sound of tiny feet skipping down the halls, even when the area was empty. I don't know what it was or what it meant, but from that night on, I never took that staircase again. Story 4. I used to work as a med tech at an assisted living facility. It wasn't the easiest job, but it paid the bills, and the residents were mostly sweet, even if some had their moments of confusion or agitation. But there was one night that still haunts me, that I'll never forget. It was the middle of summer, but the air was thick with the oppressive heat. The facility was quieter than usual, the staff a bit more sluggish than normal after a long day. I was on the night shift, a job I'd always hated, but someone had to do it. Most of the residents were asleep in their rooms. The only sounds came from the soft hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of a nurse's shoes against the tile. Margaret was one of the older residents, but she was sharp as a tack. She'd lived in the facility for years, and though she didn't have many visitors, she was well liked by the staff. She had a little pendant, like all the residents did, that they wore around their necks to call for help if they needed it. The pendant had a small button on it that, when pressed, would trigger a light at the nurse's station and alert us to come to the room. It was late when I walked past Margaret's room. Her door was shut, just as it always was at night. The soft glow of the pendant light through the crack in the door told me everything was fine. I didn't think anything of it, but I should have. A couple of hours later, things got strange. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Margaret's neighbor, another resident, Mrs. Lawson, came to the nurse's station. She was in a panic, her frail hands wringing together. "Someone's talking in Margaret's room," she said, voice shaking. "I can hear them clear as day. It's been keeping me awake for hours." We all just looked at her, confused. Margaret hadn't had any visitors in days, not since her daughter had come by a few weeks ago. We all knew the room had been vacant since Margaret's passing the night before. She had passed away unexpectedly, quietly in her sleep, and we hadn't even had time to remove her belongings before her family had come by to collect them. We brushed Mrs. Lawson off, telling her it was probably just the heat playing tricks on her mind. Maybe the vents were making noise. But I remember the look in her eyes as she left, her voice still trembling. I didn't think much of it, but something about the whole situation left me unsettled. Then came the pendant. I was at the nurse's station when I heard the chime. It was faint at first, a little beep that rang out in the stillness of the building. I glanced over at the screen. It was coming from Margaret's room. I froze. There was no way it was her. Margaret had passed away the night before. Her family had cleared out her room hours ago. There shouldn't have been any reason for the pendant to be going off. It hadn't been touched, not once since she died. My heart started to race. I told the other staff, but they just shrugged it off, muttering something about a malfunction. "Go turn it off," one of them said. I was the only one who seemed to care, or maybe I was the only one who wasn't too scared to go check. I grabbed the keys and made my way down the long hallway. As I approached her door, I could feel the air change. The temperature had dropped suddenly, even though it was a blistering summer night. A chill ran through me as I reached for the handle. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside, my breath shallow in my chest. The room was eerily quiet except for the soft hum of the pendant light still flashing. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The cold. It was freezing cold, so cold it hurt my skin. I glanced around, confused. The air conditioning had been off all day, and yet it felt like winter in that room. The pendant light above the bed flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. I couldn't explain it, but everything felt wrong. I slowly moved toward the nightstand where the pendant sat. It was still blinking, faint but insistent. I reached out, my hand trembling, and as soon as I touched the light, a sudden bang echoed from the bathroom. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The bathroom door, Margaret's bathroom, slammed shut with a violent force. I stood there frozen. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at the closed bathroom door. I could feel the air around me, thick and oppressive. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong. Without thinking, I turned and bolted for the door. I slammed it behind me, locking it, and sprinted back to the nurse's station. "Margaret's room. It's wrong," I stammered. "You need to check it." The others stared at me wide-eyed. One of the male staff members, Doug, finally spoke up. He was older, a bit gruff, but he'd been around long enough to know when something was off. "I'll go," he said. He didn't question me, but I could see the tension in his face. "Wait here." I watched him as he walked down the hall toward Margaret's room. The air felt heavier now, thick with something I couldn't explain. I heard the sound of his footsteps fade into the distance. He reached her door and paused. Then I heard him fumble with the lock. The seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, the door opened and Doug walked in. I held my breath as I waited for him to come back. When he finally returned, he didn't say anything. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a tight line. He didn't even look at me. "The door was locked when I got there," he muttered, eyes glazed over, "and there was no one in the room." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The silence that followed was worse than the loudest scream. Something had been in that room, something I couldn't explain, something that wasn't supposed to be there, something that still lingers in the back of my mind every time I close my eyes. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. I will never step foot in that room again, not for anything. Story 5. I work the night shift at a busy hospital in the maternity ward, a place that's always buzzing with activity, or so it seems. Most nights it's just me, the monitors, the occasional baby crying, and the hum of the call lights that seem to go off at the most inconvenient times, especially when no one's there. But some nights, things happen that don't make any sense. There was this one night. It started out like any other. I had just finished helping with a delivery, and the shift was winding down. The nursery was quiet, the usual lull of machines and distant footsteps echoing down the hallway. I had barely sat down to sip my cold coffee when I heard it, a soft chime, the kind of lullaby you might hear if someone had just delivered a baby. It played through the PA system, clear and sweet, the sound of newborn joy filling the sterile halls. But there was no one in the room where the button was located. I checked. No one. I was alone on the floor, the staff busy with their own tasks elsewhere. At first, I thought it was some sort of glitch. Maybe the button was stuck, or the system was malfunctioning. But then, it played again. The same lullaby, the same eerie chime, like it was celebrating something that wasn't there. I tried to shake it off. I figured it was just a technical issue, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I went over to the soundboard, checked the connections, and everything seemed fine. But the air felt different, thick, like it was holding its breath. I went back to the desk and continued working. I tried to focus, but the lullaby kept ringing in my head. I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. Not long after, the phone rang, and I answered quickly, hoping for a distraction. "Hello, this is Nurse Name. How can I help you?" The voice on the other end was frantic, shaky. "There's been a death in room 23. It's not good, nurse. We need you to come over." I could hear the distress in her voice, the kind of sound you get when something truly terrible has happened. I grabbed my things and rushed to the other unit. When I walked into room 23, I knew what she meant. The heart monitor was flat. There was a stillness in the room that made it feel like time had stopped. The woman on the bed had been with us for a while. She'd been through so much, and now she was gone. I stayed with her for a few minutes, just making sure everything was in order, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something else was happening. The moment I turned to leave, the lights flickered. But it wasn't just the lights. A soft lullaby began playing from the ceiling speakers. I froze. I knew where that sound was coming from. The button. The one you press after a delivery to announce the birth over the PA system. It wasn't supposed to play unless someone activated it. No one had touched it. The lullaby echoed through the empty halls. So soft, so unsettling. It was a beautiful tune, but that night it felt like it was mocking me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence, a glitch in the system. But as I turned to leave, the sound grew louder, like it was following me. I rushed back to the nurse's station, but the lullaby kept playing in my mind. And then, just as I sat down to gather myself, the phone rang again. My hands were shaking when I picked it up. "Hello? This is going to sound crazy, but..." The voice on the other end was a man's, and I could tell he was trying to keep it together. "We're hearing it too, the lullaby. It started playing on its own, and no one's near the button." My heart dropped. He continued, "We're on the other floor, the maternity ward. It's playing from the system, and no one has touched it. It started after the death in room 23. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Was it just some malfunction? Some sort of sick coincidence? But everything felt wrong, like there was something else going on. I hung up and rushed back to the nursery. When I arrived, I expected to find the system unplugged or shut off, but it wasn't. It was still running, and the lullaby was still playing. I reached for the plug and yanked it out. The music stopped abruptly, the silence almost deafening. I stood there, breathless, staring at the system in disbelief. But as I was walking away, it started again. The same song, the same sweet lullaby, as if the system was mocking me, reminding me of the death I'd just witnessed. I ran down the hall to the main switchboard, desperate to get everything disconnected. The lullaby kept playing in the background, echoing in my ears. It wasn't real, I told myself. It couldn't be. I had unplugged everything. There was no reason for it to keep going. But it did. It stopped only once I completely unplugged the entire system, and I thought it was over. I thought the nightmare was over. That night, after I'd gone home, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that lullaby in my head, and the next day when I came back to work, I heard it again. Just once. A soft chime that seemed to come from nowhere. The entire system had been completely disconnected. There was no way it could have played again, but it did. And I'm telling you, no one could explain it. After that, I didn't go near that system again. I couldn't. They eventually got the wiring checked, but no one ever found a reason. No one ever talked about it again. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Something happened that night. Something I still can't explain. I never stayed late after that. Story 1. The break room at my lab wasn't exactly cozy. It had the usual: a fridge humming in the corner, mismatched chairs, a coffee machine that spat out something vaguely resembling coffee. But there was something unique about ours: a memorial space. Pictures of staff who'd passed on, along with flowers, little trinkets, and sometimes handwritten notes, filled a small shelf. It was meant to honor them, but it always gave me the creeps. Maybe it was the silence that hung in the air around it, like the dead were watching. I work late shifts, and that night was no different. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as I wrapped up my work, the building practically deserted except for me and the faint echo of a cleaning crew somewhere down the hall. I was starving and decided to grab a snack from my locker in the break room. I didn't like going in there alone at night. Something about the room felt wrong, but hunger won. I pushed open the door, and the first thing I noticed was the chill. It wasn't freezing, but it was colder than it had any right to be. My breath caught as I stepped in. The hum of the fridge, the click of the clock on the wall, it all felt louder than usual. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like I wasn't alone. I kept my eyes down, focusing on the locker across the room. But out of the corner of my vision, I noticed something strange. The air by the memorial shelf seemed heavy, like the light bent around it differently. I shook my head. I was tired, I told myself. Just grab the snack and leave. And then it happened. One of their pictures, flew off the shelf. I'm not talking about it sliding off or falling gently. This thing flew. I froze, my hand halfway to my locker. It didn't make any sense. There was no wind, no draft, nothing that could have caused it. But that wasn't the worst part. The picture didn't just hit the ground. It soared across the room, almost gracefully, and landed right in front of me, face up, and it was staring at me. The woman in the photo, Mary, had been a long-time lab tech before I'd even joined the team. Everyone said she was the heart of the lab. She passed away last year, sudden aneurysm while on vacation. I'd never met her, but I'd heard plenty about her. People still talked about how much they missed her, and now her face was looking up at me, almost like she was expecting me to say something. But that wasn't all. The picture hadn't landed alone. It had somehow managed to snag someone's jacket from a nearby chair on its way down. The jacket had cushioned the fall perfectly, like the photo was being protected. I stared, my brain racing to make sense of it. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. Nope, I muttered, stepping back. But my legs felt like lead. I couldn't move. Something compelled me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was respect. But I bent down, trembling, and picked up the photo. Her eyes seemed brighter than they had any right to be in a dimly lit room. Almost alive. I swallowed hard. I don't know why I did it, but I said, "Hi, nice to meet you." My voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper, and as soon as the words left my mouth, the air in the room shifted. The heaviness lifted. It was subtle, but I felt it, like something or someone was satisfied. I didn't linger. I carefully placed the photo back on the shelf, making sure it was secure. "There you go," I said, my voice shaking. "All good now." I backed away, not taking my eyes off the shelf. Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't want to turn my back on it. Not until I was at the door. And then I bolted. I didn't stop running until I was in my car. The door locked, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I sat there staring at the entrance to the building, half expecting something or someone to come after me. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? Hey, guess what? Mary's picture flew off the wall and introduced itself to me. Yeah, that'd go over great. People would think I'd lost it. Maybe I had. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real, that she was real. The next day, I avoided the break room like the plague, but curiosity got the better of me by the afternoon. I needed to see if the picture was still there, if it was back on the shelf where I'd left it. My stomach churned as I pushed the door open. There it was, right in its spot, perfectly aligned with the others. No sign of anything unusual. But as I stared at it, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small handwritten note tucked behind the frame. It wasn't there the night before. I was sure of it. My hands shook as I reached for it, pulling it free. It was simple. Just 4 words written in neat cursive. "Thank you for listening." I didn't know what to make of it. I still don't. All I know is that I'm not stepping into that break room alone ever again. Story 2. It was my 5th year working in the hospital lab. Night shifts weren't new to me. The hum of machines and the occasional distant beeps of monitors upstairs were my constant companions. I didn't mind the solitude. There was something calming about the predictable rhythm of the analyzers and the quiet tension of being one of the few people awake and working while the world outside slept. That night started like any other. I had clocked in at 11 p.m., exchanged half-hearted pleasantries with the evening tech as they left, and settled into my routine. The machines were behaving, the samples were coming through steadily, and the coffee was still hot. By 2 a.m., I had processed over 100 specimens. I remember thinking it was one of those nights where everything just worked, until it didn't. It began with the analyzer's chime, a subtle but insistent sound that signaled an error. It wasn't uncommon. Machines act up. Tubes get stuck. Labels don't scan. I sighed, put down my coffee, and walked over to the line. The error was at the barcode reader station. A tube had jammed. At first glance, it looked simple enough to fix. The release arm had closed too early, trapping the tube halfway through the reader. I tried to dislodge it, but it wouldn't budge. I leaned in closer. The way it was wedged didn't make sense. It wasn't just stuck, it was jammed in with a force that shouldn't have been possible. I grabbed the manual release tool and gave it a nudge. Nothing. Annoyed, I applied more force, practically yanking at the release mechanism. When it finally gave, the tube shot loose and nearly fell to the floor. I caught it just in time and flipped it over to check the label. That's when my stomach dropped. The name on the tube was hers. For 44 years, she had worked in this lab. She was a legend, part of the old clinical lab technician program, back when the hospital was independent and things were done by hand. She had been the chem supervisor for as long as I could remember. Everyone respected her. Hell, we all feared her a little too. She had retired the year before after her lung cancer diagnosis. It was aggressive and the prognosis had been grim, but she never let it slow her down, even in her final days. She kept in touch, sent emails, asked about the lab. I knew she was upstairs in the ICU. We all did. She was nearing the end. I stared at the tube in my hand. It wasn't a current specimen. I remembered it immediately. One of her old blood samples, drawn months ago for a research study. It had been processed, stored, and forgotten in the stockyard, along with thousands of others. The system shouldn't have pulled it. There were no pending tests, no orders in the queue. It had been filed away, its purpose fulfilled. There was no reason for it to be on the line. Yet here it was, in my hand. I shook off the unease creeping up my spine and placed the tube in the discard rack. These things happen sometimes. Machines glitch. Maybe someone had accidentally triggered a recall, but deep down, I knew better. At 2:45 a.m., I finished clearing the error and went back to my station. The hum of the machines filled the room again, steady and predictable. I tried to focus, but my mind kept circling back to the jammed tube. 15 minutes later, my shift ended. The day shift was starting to trickle in, and I handed off the workload, careful not to mention what had happened. It was too strange, too coincidental. I didn't want to sound paranoid. As I walked out of the lab, one of the ICU nurses passed me in the hallway. She looked drained. "Rough night?" I asked. She nodded. "We lost someone." Something in her tone made my chest tighten. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She hesitated, then said her name. 2 a.m., the nurse added softly. She passed at exactly 2 a.m. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My thoughts raced back to the jammed tube, the name on the label, the time the error had occurred. 2 a.m. I spent the rest of the day replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of it. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. The system had pulled her old blood, stored away for months, and sent it through the line without an order, exactly as she took her final breath. I checked the system logs the next night, desperate for an explanation. There was no record of the tube being recalled. The analyzer logs showed the error, but nothing about why the sample had been retrieved. It was as if the machine had acted on its own. I told no one. What was there to say? To this day, I can't explain it. Machines don't just do things without reason. Blood doesn't jam itself into impossible positions, and samples from the dead don't reappear on the line moments after they've passed. But it happened. I was there. Story 3. I was stationed at the blood bank one cold, dead silent night. It was one of those nights when the air felt heavier, like something unseen was pressing down on the world. I had been interning at the hospital for about 3 months, shadowing the night shift staff. The blood bank wasn't my usual post. I typically stuck to the lab. But that night, I had been asked to fill in because someone called out sick. The blood bank was in the hospital's basement, tucked into a corner with dim fluorescent lights and the faint hum of refrigeration units. It wasn't creepy during the day, but at night, with the distant echoes of the hospital's machinery and the occasional muffled sound of footsteps upstairs, it was unnerving. There were only 2 of us that night. Me and Ethan, a fellow intern I barely knew. He was tall and wiry, with a nervous energy that made the already tense atmosphere even more unsettling. It was around 2:30 in the morning when it happened. Ethan and I had settled into a strained silence. He was scrolling on his phone, and I was flipping through a clipboard of inventory sheets, pretending to focus. The blood bank's refrigeration unit, the BB ref, as we called it, sat across the room. It was a massive glass-fronted unit with rows of labeled bags neatly organized inside. The glass was slightly fogged from the cold, a faint sheen of condensation giving it a ghostly look. "Did you hear that?" Ethan suddenly asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. I froze, my pen hovering over the clipboard. "Hear what?" I asked, my voice low. He looked at me, his eyes wide. "Like, I don't know, a tap or something." I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the hum of the fridge. "Probably just the compressor kicking on," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Ethan nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He put his phone down and stared at the fridge, his leg bouncing nervously. A few minutes passed in silence, and I started to relax. I had just convinced myself that Ethan was jumpy for no reason when I saw it. A handprint. A single clear handprint appeared on the inside of the BB referee's glass door, right at eye level. It wasn't there before. I was certain of that. The fingers were long and thin, the print slightly smudged as if the hand had pressed firmly against the cold surface. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. He was already staring at the glass, his face pale. "You see that?" he finally whispered back. I nodded. Neither of us moved. The room felt colder, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation. Condensation? A trick of the light? Someone else in the room earlier? But none of it made sense. The handprint was on the inside of the glass. There was no way anyone could have touched it without opening the fridge, and the door hadn't moved. "Maybe it's, just..." Ethan trailed off, his voice trembling. And then another one appeared, right next to the first. This time the fingers dragged down slightly, leaving streaks in the condensation. My stomach clenched. My instinct was to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. "Is someone in there?" Ethan whispered. His voice cracked, and I could hear the panic rising. "That's impossible," I said, though my voice sounded hollow. "It's locked, and it's freezing in there." But even as I said it, a third handprint appeared, higher up, as if whoever, or whatever, was inside was reaching for the top of the glass. This one was smaller, almost childlike. My breath hitched in my throat. "We need to call someone," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "Who?" I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "What are we going to say? Hey, there are ghost handprints on the blood fridge?" Before Ethan could respond, the overhead lights flickered. Not the usual dimming you get with old fluorescents. These lights went completely out for a full second before snapping back on. When they did, all the handprints were gone. Ethan let out a shaky breath, but I couldn't look away from the fridge. The glass was clean now, as if nothing had happened. "You saw that, right?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I saw it." We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, staring at the fridge. I kept expecting the handprints to come back, but they didn't. The hum of the refrigeration unit was the only sound, but it felt louder now, more oppressive. I think we should check it," Ethan finally said, though he sounded far from convinced. "Are you insane?" I hissed. But he was already standing, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the keys clipped to his badge. "We have to," he said, his voice shaking. "What if there's, I don't know, a leak or something?" "A leak?" I repeated, incredulous. "What kind of leak leaves handprints?" He ignored me and stepped toward the fridge. I wanted to stop him, but I couldn't move. I could only watch as he unlocked the door and pulled it open. A blast of icy air hit me from across the room, making me shiver. Ethan peered inside, his breath visible in the cold. "There's nothing," he said after a moment, his voice hollow. He reached in and moved a few of the blood bags aside, as if expecting to find someone hiding in the back. "It's empty." Relief and dread washed over me simultaneously. I wanted to believe him, but something about the way the handprints had appeared and disappeared so suddenly made my skin crawl. "Close it," I said, my voice shaking. "Just close it." Ethan hesitated, then slowly pushed the door shut. The lock clicked into place, and the hum of the refrigeration unit resumed its steady rhythm. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. And then we heard it, a single faint tap on the glass. Neither of us moved. The sound came again, louder this time. A tap followed by a slow, deliberate drag, like fingernails scraping against the inside of the glass. We bolted. Neither of us said a word as we ran up the stairs and into the brightly lit main hallway of the hospital. We didn't stop until we were in the staff lounge, our backs against the wall, gasping for air. I never went back to the blood bank after that night. I couldn't. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened. Ethan and I never spoke about it again. It was as if acknowledging it would make it real, and neither of us wanted that. Story 4. Our histopathology lab was a good walk away from the main hospital building, tucked into the farthest corner of the compound. If you think hospitals can feel eerie at night, try working in a separate structure surrounded by silence, away from the safety of bustling wards and bright corridors. The only way to get to it was through an older building, a relic from the early 1900s that had stood untouched for decades, carrying with it whispers of its own unsettling past. I could fill pages with the stories I've heard about that building, but I'll save those for another time. It was during one of my overnight shifts as an intern that this happened. There were 3 licensed techs overseeing the night shift that evening, along with about 10 of us interns. It wasn't uncommon for us to grow restless during these quiet hours, with not much to do except wait for the occasional specimen. The silence of the lab was oppressive at night, broken only by the whir of machines and our muffled conversations. That particular night, one of the senior techs, Miss Rivera, told us she needed to check on something back at the main lab in the hospital. She gave us a quick glance as she grabbed her coat. "Keep all the lights on," she said firmly, "and leave the radio playing. You'll thank me later." The way she said it sent a small shiver down my spine, but we shrugged it off. I exchanged a glance with my partner for the shift, Clara. She rolled her eyes and chuckled. "She acts like we're kids or something. It's just a lab." Once Miss Rivera left, the quiet swallowed us whole. For a while, we did as she'd instructed. The overhead lights cast a sterile glow over the countertops and machines, and the radio hummed softly, playing old hits no one cared about. But after a couple of hours, fatigue started creeping in. The hum of the machines became hypnotic, lulling us into a daze. "This is ridiculous," Clara groaned, rubbing her eyes. "We don't need every light in this place on, and this radio is just annoying." I hesitated for a moment, glancing at the door where Miss Rivera had disappeared earlier. Something about her tone had stuck with me, but I couldn't quite place why. Still, I wasn't about to argue. "Fine," I said, "but let's keep the desk lamp on at least, just in case." Clara smirked, satisfied. She clicked off the main lights, leaving the lab bathed in dim, uneven shadows. She flicked off the radio, and just like that, the oppressive silence returned, thicker than before. We sat at the desk, our chairs squeaking faintly as we shifted, trying to stay awake. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes later when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, just the creak of the old floors settling. But then they came again, sharp, deliberate clicks, like someone walking on tile in heels. Clara froze, her eyes locking on mine. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded slowly, my mouth dry. The steps were steady, unhurried, and they seemed to move around the lab. First near the counters, then closer to the machines, then behind us. Clara began, her voice trembling, but I shook my head sharply. "Don't," I whispered. I didn't know what else to say. We both sat there, rigid, our ears straining to track the sound. The clicks circled us, deliberate, almost taunting. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would burst. "It's probably Miss Rivera," Clara whispered, though her voice lacked any conviction. "Miss Rivera wears sneakers," I replied, barely able to get the words out. Then the footsteps stopped. We didn't dare turn around. My breath was shallow, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk so tightly they ached. The silence stretched on, unbearable, and I began to wonder if maybe somehow we had imagined it after all. And then, the chair at the far end of the room scraped loudly across the floor. Clara let out a small, choked gasp, and I felt my stomach drop. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The lights flickered on abruptly, flooding the room with harsh brightness. Miss Rivera stood in the doorway, her expression a mix of annoyance and something else, something like fear. "What the hell are you two doing?" she snapped, her voice breaking the spell. Neither of us could answer. Clara was pale, her hands shaking. I swallowed hard, trying to find words that made sense. "There were footsteps," I finally managed. Miss Rivera's eyes narrowed. "I told you to keep the lights on and the radio playing." She stepped fully into the room, glancing around as if searching for something. "This place, it doesn't like being ignored." "What do you mean?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Ms. Rivera didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the radio, turning it back on. The soft hum of music filled the room, chasing away the oppressive silence. "Just do as you're told," she said finally, her tone sharp. "And don't stay here alone again." She didn't explain further, and we didn't dare press her. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though neither of us could shake the tension that clung to the air. The next morning, as we were leaving, Clara turned to me, her face still pale. "You don't think—" "I don't want to think about it," I interrupted. But I did. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps, the deliberate, unhurried pace, the way they had circled us. And the chair, that sound still haunts me. I've heard the stories about the old hospital building, about the things that linger in places steeped in history and grief. But I never thought I'd experience it myself. I never worked another night shift in that lab again. Story 5, I worked in a small biotech lab tucked away in an industrial park. It wasn't the kind of place you'd notice unless you were looking for it. A brick building with narrow windows and an air of secrecy about it. Inside, we were surrounded by sterile white walls, humming equipment, and the faint, ever-present smell of ethanol. I'd been there for 3 years, long enough to know every creak of the floor and every flicker of the fluorescent lights. One Tuesday evening, I was working late with Sarah, one of the other lab techs. The two of us had been stuck running PCR tests all day, trying to troubleshoot an experiment that refused to cooperate. The lab was dead quiet, save for the soft whir of the centrifuge and the occasional beep from the thermal cycler. Most of the team had already left for the night, leaving the building eerily still. We hung our micropipettes on these magnetic hooks Rainin made, sleek little things that attached to the edge of the metal shelves at eye level. They kept the pipettes within easy reach, though I always felt uneasy about how precarious they looked hanging there. Sarah had just finished loading another set of samples, and I was adjusting the settings on the spectrophotometer when it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow, a shift. It was so quick, I wasn't even sure I'd seen it at all, but then I heard the faintest clink, like metal slipping against metal. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp in the silence. I turned my head just in time to see one of the pipetters, a P20, wobbling on its hook. The thing was barely hanging on, tilting further and further until, clatter, it fell, Or at least it should have. What happened next is something I've replayed in my head 100 times, trying to make sense of it. The pipetter didn't hit the floor. Instead, it dropped straight down and landed, perfectly upright, in a tip. Not just any tip, mind you. An open box of 20 microlighter tips, sitting on the edge of the bench. The pipetter plunged into one of them, standing there like some bizarre exclamation mark. For a second, neither of us said a word. We just stared at it, frozen, our eyes wide. "No way," Sarah whispered finally, breaking the silence. I walked over, my steps slow and deliberate, like I was afraid the thing might do something else. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud it drowned out the hum of the equipment. I reached out and grabbed the pipetter, pulling it free. The tip stayed attached. I held it up, turning it over in my hands as if that might reveal some trick or hidden mechanism. It didn't. It was just a pipette, the same one I'd used hundreds of times. "That's impossible," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "It's not heavy enough to fall like that. And how could it land in a tip?" I didn't have an answer. All I could think about was how fast it had moved, how precise the landing had been. It wasn't natural. It wasn't normal. We both stood there for a long time, staring at the pipetteur, the box of tips, the hook on the shelf where it had hung moments before. I don't know what I was expecting, some kind of explanation to materialize out of thin air maybe, but none came. Finally, Sarah laughed, though it sounded more nervous than amused. "Maybe it's a sign," she said. "A sign of what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She shrugged, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "I don't know. Bad luck? Ghosts? You tell me." I didn't laugh. The rest of the night was tense, and neither of us brought up the pipetter again. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I walked past the shelf, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like the air around it had changed, grown heavier somehow. The next morning, I came in early to set up for the day's experiments. Sarah wasn't in yet, and the lab was quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I went to grab a pipetter and froze. The hook where the 20 pesos had hung was empty. I frowned, glancing around the bench. It wasn't there. The box of tips was gone too. "Looking for something?" Sarah's voice startled me, and I turned to see her standing in the doorway, a coffee cup in hand. "Yeah," I said. "Did you move the 20 pesos? She frowned, setting her cup down. "Number why?" "It's not here," I said, my voice faltering. She walked over, her brow furrowed. Together we searched the bench, the drawers, and the shelves. But the pipette and the box of tips were gone. We never found them. Story 6. It was during my internship at the hospital, a grueling night shift, and I was assigned to the microbiology section. The hospital's laboratory was a maze of fluorescent-lit corridors, sterile counters, and the cold hum of machines. The staff were used to working late into the night, and for the most part, we were left to our own devices. That particular night, it was my turn to handle the specimen logging. The lab was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that sits heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the distant murmur of voices from the receiving area. My colleagues, both the staff and my fellow interns, had drifted off to their usual corners. Some were chatting at the receiving area, others loitered near the lab's main doors. I was alone in my section, a corner tucked farthest from anyone else. It must have been close to 11 p.m. when it happened. I remember it clearly because I had just checked the time while flipping through a microbiology textbook. Exams were coming up, and every spare second counted. With the specimens logged, I decided to use the downtime to cram. The first sign that something was wrong came subtly. I felt it rather than heard it, a shift in the air, as though someone had moved close enough to brush against me. A faint chill ran along my arms, though I ignored it. Old buildings like this one had drafts, and I chalked it up to that. But then I heard it, a whisper. Low, soft, and unmistakable, it came from just behind me. The sound was so close it could have come from below my shoulder. Low enough to match the height of a child. "Hey!" My breath hitched. The whisper wasn't loud, but it was there, clear as day. I froze, my pen hovering over the page I had been jotting notes on. For a split second, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. After all, the lab was deserted on my end, and no one else was near me. Then it came again. "Hey!" The voice was playful, almost teasing, and yet there was a strange, hollow quality to it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, but I couldn't move. It felt as though something was holding me in place, paralyzing me with a mix of fear and dread. Finally, I snapped out of it. Heart racing, I spun around in my chair, my eyes darting wildly around the room. Nothing, just rows of sterile counters, stacks of specimen containers, and the faint hum of the equipment. I bolted. Adrenaline coursed through me as I dashed out of the section, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I burst into the receiving area, where I found the staff and interns huddled together, laughing about something. My arrival was sudden enough to startle them. "What's wrong with you?" one of my co-interns asked, her smile fading as she took in my wide eyes and trembling hands. "You guys are jerks," I blurted, still catching my breath. "Why would you sneak up on me like that? Who whispered behind me?" Their confusion was immediate and unfeigned. "What are you talking about?" another intern asked, frowning. "You were in my section, weren't you?" "Someone whispered behind me, twice." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. One of the senior technicians stepped forward, her face serious. "We've been here the whole time," she said, gesturing to the group. "No one's left this area for the past 20 minutes. A cold knot of fear tightened in my chest. I turned to my co-interns. "What about you guys? Were you near the lab door?" They shook their heads. "No," one of them said firmly. "We've been standing here. Why?" My stomach dropped. The distance between their location and my section was far too great for anyone to have whispered to me and returned unnoticed. It didn't make sense. My heart pounded as my thoughts spiraled, trying to find a logical explanation. And then I remembered. At the start of our internship, one of the staff had shared a story. It had seemed harmless at the time, a silly ghost tale meant to scare the newbies. She had spoken about a child who was said to haunt the microbiology section, a mischievous presence that made itself known late at night. According to her, there had been incidents over the years, unexplained laughter, faint whispers, and, most unsettlingly, the heavy glass door that separated the lab from the corridor, opening and closing on its own. I laughed it off when she told us. It had seemed like just another urban legend, the kind of thing you hear in old hospitals. But now, standing there in the brightly lit receiving area, surrounded by confused faces, the memory hit me like a freight train. The whisper, the child's height, the playful, teasing tone. "No," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. "What is it?" the senior technician asked, her tone cautious. I shook my head, unwilling to say it out loud. If I acknowledged it, if I gave it weight, it would make the experience all too real. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I avoided my section for as long as I could, sticking close to the others whenever possible. But even with the company, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision sent my heart racing. When my shift finally ended, I left the hospital as quickly as I could. I didn't tell anyone else what had happened, and I didn't dare bring it up again with my co-interns. Some things are better left unspoken, but I'll never forget the whisper. The way it sounded so close, so human, and yet so utterly wrong. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced that night, and I don't think I want to. Story 7. I work in a hospital laboratory, specifically the blood bank. It's a tightly secured area. No one gets in without proper clearance. And even then, people are usually too busy to wander in unannounced. It's one of those places where every sound matters. The faint hum of the centrifuge, the beep of a machine signaling completion, or the muffled footsteps of a colleague. These become your soundtrack during long, solitary shifts. It was a Friday night, close to midnight, and the hospital was quieter than usual. I had volunteered for the late shift because I preferred the calm. I was stationed at my bench, focused on cross-matching blood for a patient in the ICU. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, and the sterile smell of alcohol swabs hung in the air. I wasn't thinking about much, just running through my tasks as efficiently as possible. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a swinging lab coat brushing through the doorway to my left. The blood bank has 2 doors, The one on the far side is an exit, heavy with a hydraulic arm that creaks loudly every time it's open. The other is the main entrance, always propped open because we're already inside a secure lab. No one sneaks in or out of this place without being noticed. So when I saw the coat swinging, I naturally assumed someone had walked in to drop off a sample. "Hey," I said without looking up, expecting to hear a colleague's voice or see a gloved hand reaching out with a labeled vial. But there was no reply. I glanced toward the door. No one. The bench where samples are usually dropped off was empty. For a moment, I thought maybe whoever it was had doubled back. Maybe they forgot something. But I hadn't heard the creak of the exit door. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. "Hello," I called out, louder this time. Silence. I set the test tube down carefully, my hands suddenly shaky. I turned in my chair to get a full view of the room. The blood bank isn't large. The entire area is visible with a quick sweep of the eyes. Rows of labeled refrigerators hummed against the walls, their tiny green lights glowing steadily. The workstation computers were all idle. No one was there. I got up, my lab coat swishing around my knees as I moved toward the entrance. The corridor outside was deserted, its bright lights making the emptiness feel even starker. There were no footsteps fading into the distance, no voices echoing down the hall. Just stillness. I went back inside, shaking my head. Maybe I'd imagined it. Lack of sleep, long hours. It wouldn't be the first time my mind had played tricks on me. Still, I felt uneasy. I returned to my station, my back now fully aware of how exposed it was to the open room. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but every creak of the building, every faint sound seemed amplified. My eyes darted to the doorway every few seconds. Then it happened again. This time, I didn't just see it, I felt it. A gust of cold air brushed past me, making the hairs on my arms stand up beneath my lab coat. The kind of cold that doesn't belong in a climate-controlled lab. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the counter. "Who's there?" My voice sounded small, even to me. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerators and the distant whir of a centrifuge spinning in the adjoining room. My chest tightened. I walked over to the heavy exit door and tested it. It hadn't been opened. I could tell by the resistance of the hydraulic arm. I checked the main entrance next, still propped open as always. And yet someone, or something, had been here. I was sure of it. I returned to my bench, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner of the room. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a draft from the ventilation system, though I'd never felt anything like that before. Maybe it was a trick of the light, though I knew what I'd seen. I sat back down and stared at the blood tubes lined up in front of me. The labels blurred as my mind raced. Then from behind me I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against metal. My breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. My eyes landed on the far corner of the room, near the storage cabinets. Nothing. Just rows of neatly stacked supplies, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. No answer, but I swear I felt eyes on me, watching, waiting. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stood, my legs shaky, and edged toward the door. I didn't care if I looked ridiculous bolting from an empty room. I needed to get out of there. As I reached the threshold, I heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A low, breathy whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly. I didn't stop to investigate. I ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I didn't stop until I reached the main lab, where a coworker looked up from her workstation, startled. "Are you okay?" she asked, her face a mix of concern and confusion. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I explain what had just happened without sounding insane? After a moment, I managed to nod and mutter something about needing fresh air. I never worked alone in the blood bank after that. Whatever I saw, or thought I saw, never happened again. Story 8. I've worked in the lab for over 5 years, and I pride myself on being meticulous. You have to be in this field. One slip-up can mean life or death for a patient. That's why this particular event has been etched in my memory. It wasn't just unusual, it was something I can't explain. It started as an ordinary shift. I was covering the night rotation, where things tend to get quiet. Nights like these are supposed to be easy. Run a few tests, log some results, and wait for the clock to hit the end of the shift. The hospital was dimly lit, as always, with that faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional echo of footsteps in the corridors. Around 1 a.m., I decided to take my break. I told the nurses on the floor, "If you have any EPOC samples, please process them yourselves while I'm out." They nodded as they always did, and I stepped away to grab a coffee from the vending machine down the hall. 15 minutes later, I returned to the lab. The room felt colder, which wasn't unusual. The AC in our department has a habit of going haywire at night. But something felt off. I went to check the specimen drop-off tray, and there it was. A small, unlabeled sample vial sitting dead center in the bin. I froze. "Who dropped this off?" I muttered aloud. But of course, no one was there to answer. I leaned closer. The vial was slightly chilled, like it had been freshly collected, but it had no patient ID, no timestamp, nothing. Just a faint residue on the outside, as though someone had handled it with damp gloves. My first instinct was that a nurse forgot to label it, which happens occasionally, but then I remembered I was on break. The nurses know better than to drop off samples when the lab tech is unavailable. They're supposed to run their own EPOCS if I'm not around. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, trying to make sense of it. The fluid inside was clear, almost unnaturally so. No cloudiness, no sediment. I placed it on the counter and immediately went to the nurse in charge of the patient rounds. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did someone drop off an EPOC sample while I was out?" She furrowed her brow. "Not that I know of. Everyone's running their own tonight." "Well, one showed up in the lab. Do you know who worked with the patient it might have come from?" She glanced at her chart. "Looks like Nurse Carter had the most recent collection. But if she didn't label it, I'll check with her," I cut in, already turning to leave. Nurse Carter was in room 218, tidying up after administering meds. When I asked her about the sample, her face went pale. "I handled all the collections on my list," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But not that one. I swear I labeled everything I touched." "Are you sure?" She nodded frantically. "Positive. Every sample I took tonight is already processed. That's not mine." The unease in her eyes sent a shiver down my spine. I thanked her and decided to ask the attending physician, thinking maybe someone had forgotten to log the collection properly. Dr. Malik was in his office, typing notes into the computer. When I posed the same question to him, he leaned back in his chair, confused. "No one informed me of any new collections," he said, "and I haven't ordered an EPOC test for hours." I ran a hand through my hair. "Then where did it come from?" "It was sitting in the drop-off tray when I got back." He shrugged. "Maybe someone from another floor made a mistake." I didn't reply. Something about his nonchalant tone irritated me, but it wasn't his fault. I left his office, my mind racing. Back in the lab, the vial was still sitting on the counter where I'd left it. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to just process it or toss it into biohazard. But then I noticed something I hadn't before. The fluid inside the vial wasn't completely still. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was a faint ripple, as if the liquid was moving on its own. I leaned in closer. No vibration from the counter, no draft from the air vents. The ripple continued, undisturbed. "Okay, this is ridiculous," I muttered. I grabbed the phone and called the charge nurse again. "Listen," I said, keeping my voice low. "Are you absolutely sure no one dropped off a sample for room 218 or anywhere nearby?" There was a pause on the other end. "Room 218, she repeated slowly. "That's odd. We discharged the patient there hours ago. That room's empty now." I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean, empty? Nurse Carter was in there when I spoke to her." "She shouldn't have been," the charge nurse replied. "That room's been vacant since 10 p.m. I hung up without saying another word. My legs felt like lead as I walked back to the lab. I don't know what I expected to find, but when I rounded the corner and stepped inside, my heart stopped. The vial was gone. It hadn't rolled away or fallen off the counter. It was simply gone, The drop-off tray was empty too, as though it had never been there to begin with. I stood there staring at the empty counter, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Did someone come in while I was gone? Was this some kind of sick joke? I checked the lab's security footage later that night, desperate for an explanation. The timestamp showed the moment I left for my break. The room was still, quiet. No one entered. At exactly 1:12 a.m., the camera glitched for a fraction of a second, a brief flicker of static. When the feed resumed, the vial was sitting in the tray. I replayed the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it. But there was nothing. No movement, no shadow, no sign of anyone entering the lab. I don't work night shifts anymore. I told my supervisor I couldn't handle the hours, but that's not the truth. I just couldn't stay in that lab, knowing what I saw, or rather, what I didn't see. To this day, I don't know where that sample came from, and I don't want to know. Story 9. I work in a hospital lab that used to be the morgue. It's not something we talk about much. It just lingers in the air like the smell of old disinfectant. I didn't know about it when I started my clinical rotations last year, but once I found out, I couldn't unsee it. The narrow hallways, the oddly heavy doors, even the faint echo that followed you when you walked alone. It all made sense. One night during my clinicals, I was in the chemistry section with a coworker, Allie. It was late, the kind of late where the world outside feels empty. We were chatting about nothing in particular, filling the silence with laughter and small talk. I remember leaning back in my chair, stretching my neck. The lab felt cold, colder than usual, but I shrugged it off. Allie was telling some story about her dog when I felt it. A hand, cold, deliberate, brushed the back of my neck. I swear it wasn't just a draft or my imagination. It was a touch, clear as day, and I jumped out of my chair like I'd been shocked. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, spinning around. Allie looked up, startled at first, then burst out laughing. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, still giggling. "Someone just touched my neck," I said, rubbing the spot. It still tingled, like the ghost of that touch was clinging to me. "There's no one here," she said, looking around dramatically. "Maybe it was Casper." I forced a laugh, but my heart was pounding. The lab was empty except for the two of us. And yet I could still feel it. The pressure, the icy sensation. I didn't sleep that night. When I started working full-time, I pushed that memory aside. It was probably my imagination, I told myself. Stress, lack of sleep, it could have been anything. But then there was the stockroom. The stockroom was the worst part of the lab. It was a long, narrow room lined with shelving carts crammed full of supplies. The overhead lights were dim, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift whenever you moved. I hated going in there alone, but it was part of the job. One day I was restocking gloves and tubes when it happened. I was standing at one of the shelves checking off inventory when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved. A figure, a shadow maybe, peeking around one of the carts. It was quick, just a flash, but unmistakable. It wasn't just a trick of the light. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. I took a step back, craning my neck to see around the carts. There was no one there. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then it moved again. A head, just barely visible, tilting as if watching me. I didn't wait to see more. My heart was hammering as I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Back in the main lab, I leaned against the counter, trying to catch my breath. Allie was there, typing something into the computer. She glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, just thought I saw something in the stockroom." She smirked. "Let me guess, Casper again?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because whatever I saw, it wasn't friendly. After that, I avoided the stockroom as much as possible, but the feeling stayed with me. The cold, the weight of unseen eyes. The lab wasn't just a place to work. It was something else. Something that still remembered what it used to be. Story 10. Here's a story based on your guidelines. It was just another night shift at the lab, or so I thought. I work in a clinical diagnostics lab. Late hours, long silences, and the hum of machines have become my constant companions. That night, I was alone. My coworker had called in sick, and I didn't mind. I actually enjoyed the quiet. Less chatter, more focus. The lab is located in the basement of a larger facility, so no windows, no distractions. The air is always still, unnervingly so. The only sounds are the buzz of fluorescent lights and the occasional whir of the centrifuge. It's the kind of silence that presses against you, making you hyper-aware of every noise, every movement. It was around 2 a.m. when it happened. I had just retrieved a vial of QC from the freezer, a bio-rad control, glass bottle, sturdy and solid. Frozen solid, actually. You don't need to be delicate with it, but I always was. It's a habit. I set it down on the table behind me to defrost, far from the edge where it wouldn't roll or be accidentally knocked over. I went back to my work, running samples and recording data. I had my back to the table, completely absorbed in my task. The minutes passed in that strange, elastic way they do during night shifts, time feeling both slow and fast at once. Then out of nowhere, there was a sound. Clang. The sharp noise of glass hitting tiles startled me so much that I jumped, my heart hammering in my chest. I spun around, my hand still holding the pipette I'd been using. The vial of QC lay on the floor behind me, completely intact. It hadn't shattered, which was a miracle considering how far it had fallen. But here's the thing, it shouldn't have fallen at all. I froze, staring at it, my mind racing. The table where I'd left it was solid, flat, and stable. I'd placed it nowhere near the edge. Nowhere near. There was no airflow in the lab. The AC was off. The vent hadn't even rattled that night. The vial was still mostly frozen, heavy, with no chance of rolling or toppling over by itself. I stepped closer, slowly, every hair on my body standing on end. My logical brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe I hadn't placed it as securely as I thought. Maybe I'd bumped the table without realizing it. Maybe. But then I saw something that made me stop dead. On the floor around where the vial had landed was a faint smear of condensation, almost like a handprint. No, not almost. It was a handprint. It was too large to be mine and too distinct to ignore. 5 fingers, pale and ghostly, trailing off into nothingness. I crouched, staring at it, my breath shallow. My first instinct was to touch it, but I stopped myself. It was already fading, evaporating into the still air of the lab. A cold wave swept through me. I stood up quickly, backing away. My eyes darted to the corners of the room, the shadows that seemed deeper now than they had just minutes before. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, or maybe it was just my imagination. I grabbed the vial off the floor, my fingers trembling, and placed it back on the table, this time dead center. My rational mind tried to take control again. Maybe I'd just seen a weird smudge. Maybe the vial had somehow slid off despite every logical reason it shouldn't have. But deep down, I knew better. I tried to get back to work, but my focus was gone. Every little noise made me flinch. The hum of the centrifuge felt sinister, like it was hiding something beneath its mechanical rhythm. Half an hour passed and then another. Nothing else happened, but the room felt different, oppressive, like I wasn't alone anymore. At 4 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I logged out early, something I never do, and left the lab in a hurry. The silence in the hallway outside felt like a relief, though it shouldn't have. Silence is silence, right? But not in that lab. Not anymore. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my supervisor, not my coworkers. What could I say? A frozen vial of QC flew off a table, and I saw a ghostly handprint. They'd laugh, or worse, they'd think I'd lost it. But I know what I saw. I haven't worked a night shift since. I make excuses, swap schedules, whatever it takes. And when I do work late, I make sure someone else is there. I don't care how ridiculous it sounds. I'm not being alone in that lab ever again. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.